Hi everyone. So firstly, thanks again for giving me the opportunity to talk. So my so the title of my talk is Enabling Transparent and Trustworthy AI. In particular, I want to talk about two concepts, that is adversarial manipulation and interpretation in the domain of computer vision when we are dealing with the technology of deep learning. Now, although I am working broadly in the domain of artificial intelligence, my particular subfield is computer vision, which is kind of a sister field, um, of machine learning. So I have been able to apply multiple techniques of machine learning to different problems in computer vision. And for example, sparse representation, deep learning, and Bayesian machine learning. Lately, I have been involved in using deep learning for different tasks in computer vision. Yeah, some of these projects or the problems that I have worked with. So I have led these some teams, and sometimes I have also worked in collaboration. So in computer vision, due to the nature of the field, we have this liberty to explore multiple problems at the same time. So I have taken full liberty and worked on a lot of problems here. But today, what I would like to talk about is the problem of adversarial attacks and explanation methods in computer vision. So this research has been generously funded by some renowned agencies like Google Research, DARPA, and Office of National Intelligence Australia, Australian Research Council. So I would also like to acknowledge the funding from these agencies. Now, when I talk about deep learning, so deep learning is a technology that is doing very well in the field of computer vision. Essentially, deep learning models are neural networks that we use. This here is a typical model that we use, which is convolutional neural network. So it's an illustration, and this model, normally these models in computer vision, they are performing very well. For example, this is a model of classifier that is able to recognize any image with almost human level performance when we input this image to it. But at the same time, although we are achieving great performance, we have a problem that these models are essentially black boxes. We cannot truly explain in a human understandable manner that what the model has learned from its training data and how is it using it in making its decisions. So it is kind of like an interesting problem in vision, and it is intrinsic to deep learning models. The reason being that these models actually represent complex mathematical functions. Now, the complexity of these functions actually give these models their strength, but at the same time, since they are so complex, they are hard to explain. And although we can explain what each of these functions, basically in a neural network, what happens is that you can see that these are like a set of layers that I have illustrated here. Now, each one of these layers, you can think of them as a mathematical function. And the whole network actually takes the form of a hierarchical function, which is quite complex. Although we are able to look into this function, for example, the first layer, we can see what are the model parameter weights and how the function is working, and we can understand those. But when combined, this becomes a problem. So we cannot really explain in a human understandable manner that how this mapping from input to output, that's working. So now this complexity of this function, basically, it also has created some other problems for deep learning. For example, in this particular case, I am able to manipulate this image to make the model think that this is an image of an ostrich. So this kind of manipulation, this is known as adversarial attacks on deep learning. And not only that, there are some other forms of model manipulation as well. For example, in this case, I have put a small mark here at the bottom, and now the model thinks that this is an image of a flower. Now, what's happening there, I will explain in this slide. So in this case, I have added a very weak signal to this image, which is actually humanly imperceptible. I have exaggerated that signal here so that we can see. But as you can see, this image and that one, they appear quite similar to us. But for the model, this image actually looks something like this. Now, this is also, a similar kind of, similar kind of manipulation can be done with done here. So I have made the model sensitive to this particular sign here or symbol here. Whenever you put this particular symbol in any image, the model would think that this is an image of a flower. Now, we don't really mind confusing a puppy with a flower, but sometimes things can get serious. So naturally, there are many funding agencies and research agencies that are interested in this kind of manipulation of deep learning in computer vision. So we recently had a couple of successful projects with US Defense Advanced Research Project agencies. And in those projects, we explored the extent to which we can manipulate deep learning with these kind of attacks, and also developed some defense techniques against these kind of attacks. Now, I will not go into the details of what we actually did in these projects, but both of these projects were actually inspired by one of our previous works in which we were able to show some defense techniques against these kind of attacks. And again, I will just ask you to focus on this core part here. The main idea of this technique is that we proposed. It is that for any neural network, we can actually append a set of further neural layers that can pre-process the image for us. And that pre-processing would be such that it will not harm any benign or natural image, but it will help us in taking out any adversarial signal from the adversarially manipulated images. So we were able to show that this technique worked pretty well. To give you an example, here are some images. So in the first row, you can see these are original images. And these are the labels of the models that are basically classifiers, and they are able to recognize these images with very high confidence and correct label. But when you apply these adversarial attacks on these images, now this for CafeNet, this particular image is a wooden spoon, this is a pencil box, and this is a green slide. So with our technique applied, we were able to show that we are able to get the correct label back and also restore the confidence of the network on the correct images or correct labels. So, yeah. So far what I have talked about are these kind of attacks. These are known as adversarial attacks. And in this case, I am manipulating the images and the model remains safe. So the model is not being tampered with. But in these kind of images, these kind of attacks, I have just told you that I made the model sensitive to this particular symbol here. So the model is being manipulated here. Now, my recent research fellowship that was with Office of National Intelligence Australia, that was about trying to discover if the model is somehow corrupted with these kind of attacks. So, to that end, yeah. So, by the way, these kind of attacks are known as black box or Trojan attacks in the literature. So, and the way they work is that if you give a clean image to a deep learning model, it behaves normally. The model behaves normally. But if you put the trigger somewhere on the image, anywhere, any trigger which is unknown to the model user, the model starts to misbehave. So the idea here was to somehow use the explanation method or XAI, explainable AI, to discover if the model has been corrupt somehow during the training process. So this was the core topic of my recent fellowship. Now, to actually look at, to solve this problem, basically we had to look at some XAI or explanation AI tools that were available at the time to to the solution to this problem. So generally the sort of tools that are available even currently, so they behave like this. Basically, if you give an input to a model and the model here predicts that this is an image of a cat, the explanation tool would normally provide you with a heat map that would say the model is focusing at this particular region of the image. So that's why it's saying it's a cat. And in the case of dog, this is the region that it's focusing at. So now these kind of explanation tools, they generally work well, but sometimes they don't. But in any case, they are considered as a very important part of the XAI within the computer vision domain. So from that perspective, I would like to just briefly mention one of the important methods, post hoc explanation tool that we use, how that works to give you an idea. So let's say if you have this original image and you want to explain the prediction of the model on that image, for this particular image, you will first define a baseline image. In this case, it's a null image. So it's a method proposed by Sundar Rajan et al. So in the original proposal, they say that the baseline should be a null image. And then you define a path between these two images. In this case, it is just a linear path. So on that path, you simply compute a range of images. And so these are, for example, on a linear path, it's just a linear interpolation that you need to perform. And then for each of these images, you pass them to the model and you use gradient descent, use backpropagation algorithm to compute the model's gradient for these images, and then combine those gradients to finally get this kind of map here. Now, so again, so these finding these gradients, that's just a standard procedure that we do in deep learning. And if you are into maths, this is the exact formulation, mathematical formulation that we use. But this is exactly what I have said in the previous slide. So I will not bore you with the maths equations here. Now, in this integrated gradient, we found out when we were exploring this, we found out there were, of course, there are two things to choose from. One is the baseline that we need to choose, and the other is the path that we need to decide. And we found out that there, in these both choices, the current literature lack in this optimal selection of these two things. So we proposed a method in which we were able to show that if you want to choose a baseline for this particular image, you will have to, it's not optimal to choose a null baseline in computer vision because this method originally is inspired from game theory and it has been translated directly to computer vision. But in our case, when we explored it a little bit, we found out that this is not really the optimal choice. Actually, the optimal choice would be to select another image that would actually reside quite close to this image in the internal representation space of the model. So the selection needs to be very careful. And the other thing that we discovered was that although this linear path is generally, it works fine, but you need to be careful about the features or the features that you integrate finally in the, to get the explanation. Otherwise, your explanation is not reliable. Similarly, we also looked at in another form of this post hoc explanation tool. So if you have ever worked with medical images with deep learning, so probably you know the GradCam algorithm. So this kind of algorithm, again, it tells you where the model is looking at, but as you can see the image here, the heat map is quite low resolution, so it's like a blur here. So with our algorithm, we were able to focus this heat map, and the explanation were quite reliable after when we apply our technique. Now, here I have talked about some techniques which are known as post hoc methods, post hoc explanation methods. Although we are explaining the models here with these techniques, but the problem that our problem is not solved. The reason is that in all of these cases, the model was a black box before we had these explanation tool, and it still is a black box for us. We are actually not looking inside the model. So what all we are doing is that we are saying that this is the particular region on which the model is focusing to get this particular explanation. So this is not what we are looking at, because in the black that Trojan attacks, the model has been manipulated. So we need to look inside the model. Now, here are some dots that we need to connect. Firstly, we had these adversarial attacks, and you know that we had a defense mechanism that we proposed that worked quite well. And I should mention that it works within a certain parameters. It's not a generic solution. So yeah, so this is a limitation of the method as well. But we wanted to then use the model interpretation tools to get the solution of Trojan attacks, somehow detect the Trojan attacks in the models. But that did not work for us. So what we did was we actually used another form of adversarial attack that we had proposed earlier to develop a model interpretation tool that actually worked for the Trojan attacks. I will try to explain that in the next few slides, how that works. So previously, this is what I had shown you previously. So we had this image and noise and this adversarial image. This method was previously proposed by Google back in 2013, but it has a limitation. So this noise signal, it has been computed systematically and it works only for this image. Even if you make a slight variation in this image, any kind of variation like changing the contrast of the image, for example, this signal will break down and the attack will not work. So as compared to that, we had in our lab developed another form of adversarial perturbation or adversarial attack that would work for any image of a particular class to make the model think that this is an image of another class. For example, ostrich, any image of ostrich would become an image of a German Shepherd with high probability. But this signal will not affect on any other class. For example, the image of jellyfish, that will still be considered a jellyfish by the model. So this was the attack that we had developed in our lab, and when we were developing it, the main idea behind it was also using the gradients of the model, just like integrated gradients. But it was in a different settings, in a different manner. But what we saw in our perturbations of these signals was that there was certain spatial correlation that was appearing, so certain geometric features that we were witnessing. So we hypothesized that these geometric features are actually they relate to the model's understanding of a particular concept. For example, if we are trying to make the ostrich class into stingrays with our perturbation, we were able to see some features that resembled the stingray class. So we did verify these hypotheses with some interesting problems as well. For example, here, these are some images. We gave this image, for example, to the model and compute our signal so that this image would appear as a hummingbird to the model. And then we had that noisy signal. When we add that noisy signal to this image, we actually see that even for humans, this image started to appearing like hummingbird. So you can see another example here, and these are the examples of mountain tent. So, and we also had another interesting application that we were able to show, which is known as image manipulation. For example, in this case, this is the rough drawing which you can make on PowerPoint maybe, and then give it to the model, compute the perturbation for this image to be predicted as a primary. And the model was able to generate a noise that actually made it look like a primary. So yeah, now I should mention that these images that I'm showing you, they have been created with classifiers. So a classifier is normally required to discriminate between the images, not generate new images. But we were able to show that it is possible to generate the images with the classifier as well. Now I come to the idea of using this kind of notion to develop an explanation method. So what we did in our method was that for a given model, we assume a probability distribution over its training data, and from that distribution we sample certain points. Now a model, as I mentioned, is a mathematical function. So it has, in this case, it has a certain, what we call a loss surface associated with it. And this is, loss surface means that it will have multiple local minima. And if you fall into this, a particular minima, that would be an association of the model to a particular human understandable concept. For example, this here is, it could be an ostrich for the model. Now what we tried was that we, by putting certain points, like random points from this distribution on this surface, we were trying to map the, the surface of the lost surface, and we kept on integrating the gradients of the model in a certain manner and then projected it to an image kind of grid. We kept on doing this kind of, with multiple iterations. We did that, and after a while we defined the signal that we were receiving, and those signals are basically the output of our explanation method. So these are some of the results. So what we are looking at is, these are the general concepts. So a typical example from the training data that the model has been trained on to recognize a concept, for example, of a thimble image. Now our signal was able to reproduce with model gradients only, which are considered highly noisy signals. Some images that was actually, they were looking like a thimble in this case. For example, this is the centipede, so some images clearly showing centipede. So this is the first instance where we were able to look inside the model non-invasively with just the gradients of the model. And these concepts were like human understandable. So our hypothesis was that since we are now able to look at what the model thinks of a particular concept, and when the model is actually sensitive to a trigger pattern, it recognizes a trigger pattern to a particular class, then we should be able to see some patterns that resemble the trigger as well. So these are some of the examples that we used as triggers, and ran a few experiments in which we chose a target class, which is in this case a castle. So which means that any image you give to the model with any of these signatures here, it will think that it's an image of a castle. So when we applied our algorithm to explain the concept of castle for the model, it was quite clear that these kind of symbols, they started to appearing in our algorithm in the output. So this was one of its kind explanation tool that was able to actually see inside the model and develop some human understandable concepts that we could relate to the inputs. Now this was also true, this is just one of the results. We ran multiple experiments and we were able to show that these kind of patterns, the trigger patterns, they consistently appeared somewhere in the images. Now, so through this we were able to detect the Trojan attacks that, with human inspection, the Trojan attacks were developed. So, yeah, so this is basically it that I wanted to talk about. So here I have just talked about adversarial attacks and backdoor attacks. And normally adversarial attacks in particular, they are thought as a major weakness of deep learning nowadays. But here we are turning the table and basically using this weakness as a strength to manage another weakness of deep learning. Thank you.